1979, the British Broadcasting Corporation honoured the UK with a 10-part series where, week by week, we saw a blend of science and the supernatural unfold before our very eyes. The spectator found themselves catapulted into some profoundly dark realms with tales of Ouija boards, extrasensory perception, ghostly manifestations, and governmental conspiracy, where the study of the paranormal and the paranoid were woven into installments of witchcraft, of possession, and where mind-bending drugs turned mild-mannered, law-abiding citizens into killing machines, and where armies of the past burst into the present, with a modern military experiment being the key. Top secret officials from Downing Street loomed from their clandestine shadows to reveal to us what is the Omega Factor. There are some cases of television which are customarily scoffed as atrocious, and yet they persevere for innumerable years. A standard model is the TV programme Crossroads. I could quote a few personal ones of mine, but I wouldn't imagine for 1 minute you would have 2 or 3 hours to spare. New shows can be, at the time, critically flayed and retire swiftly, yet be far exceptional. One lesson of this has to be the Omega Factor, which had a single 10-episode run in the summer of 1979. In the Guardian newspaper on the 14th of June 1979, critic Nancy Banks Smith chided,
"The Omega Factor is a series in 10 parts, or in my case 1 part, which advances the cause of telepathy and telekinesis. Though not television, I am myself, in some humble sort, psychic, and by the pricking of my thumbs can detect the great thundering plates of an oncoming cliché. Married couples often develop this sort of telepathy after 40 years or 40 minutes of programs like the Omega Factor, whichever may be the longer. They face each other and say, absolutely simultaneously, 'What a load of old rope.' Eerie, really."
That was impressively cunty.
In my opinion, the Omega Factor is an awesome series, not only for its subject matter, but for the certitude that there is a key sequential component, the lasting backstory which expands into the main motif of the programme by the final episode. The aggravating element about the Omega Factor is that there was no follow-up, as we are left dangling in midair at the denouement of the last episode. It is chock full of fascinating, probable turning points, which leaves us desperate to know what happens next. Unless, of course, you're Nancy Banks Smith. The series came about due to the failure of another, that being BBC Scotland's The Standard, which starred Patrick Malahide. The series was about an ailing Scottish newspaper, and alas, the audience for this show was ailing too. It wasn't a hit. However, the budget and the vacancy for the show in the time slots were freely available, and Roderick Graham, the show's producer, who became the head of BBC Scotland's programming, needed something in its place, rather hastily, and so George Galasio, who worked for the BBC, was approached to contribute something in its place. Galasio already had a decent portfolio and had worked his way up the hierarchies of the BBC, including being the production unit manager on some of Doctor Who's golden-aged hits. Galasio had an infectious enthusiasm in the paranormal and got in touch with Jack Gerson, who had been writing for numerous BBC programmes since the 1960s, with Z-Cars and The Regiment on his CV. But it was Gerson's writing for the series Sutherland's Law that fazed Galasio the most. Gerson was also fascinated by the paranormal, and this proved to be a winning combination. Both Gerson and Galasio decided to make a series where thriller and metaphysical could link. Dr. Archie Ray was also carried into the mix, who at the time was a professor of psychology at Glasgow University and had a niche interest in the field of parapsychology. Dr. Ray said he would be amenable to read the scripts and discuss the ideas concerning the programme to ensure they could be as accurate and realistic as possible. James Hazeldine, Galasio's first choice of actor, was contacted for the main protagonist part and accepted it. It had also been a year since Louise Jameson bowed out of Doctor Who as companion Leela, and due to Galasio's affiliation with the series, he contacted Louise Jameson and felt she would have the qualities to represent the main support to Hazeldine's lead. All that was needed was the other supporting character, and actor John Carlyle was contacted. Galasio considered Carlyle to be an archetypical classic actor and could bring the much-needed ambiguity to the role of the head of a government department whom you wouldn't guess until the very last whether he was there for good or for sinister. With Cyril Luckham agreeing to play the part of the main villain,
beware. Beware.
the Omega Factor was born, although it was done in a bit of a rush, and time was most certainly of the essence. Omega's pivotal character, played by Hazeldine, is Tom Crane, a self-employed reporter based in London but with Scottish heritage. Crane has made a name for himself as an investigator of the occult, and his investigations for his next article leads him into meeting with the ominous Edward Drexel, a once dishonourable name in the field of the arcane, who now resides in Edinburgh. Crane is barely appreciative. He has psychic capabilities, but these come into the fore during the crises which follow. Crane's wife Julia and his brother Michael have become embroiled with psychiatrist Roy Martindale, who works for the enigmatic Department 7 in Edinburgh, although to most they are most certainly defined as a fringe organisation, as Roy explains here.
You're too involved, personally. That area is out of bounds to you, Crane, and you know it.
Thanks very much.
Dr. Reynolds at least knows how to obey orders. She knows that this department hangs on by the skin of its teeth to its appropriation. HMG, the civil servants and the rest don't like us. Don't believe in what we're doing. Party tricks, one minister described our work as.
Party tricks that drive people out of their minds. Party tricks that kill.
I beg your pardon.
You heard me. There are deaths. Not just driving people out of their minds, provoking ancient Pictish figures to get up and go walkabout, driving dogs mad. Death!
The army knows what it's at. Everything's carefully controlled.
That's what you say, but it doesn't square with the facts, does it? What if the controller's been got at from the outside? What if he isn't in control at all? What then? You think your precious ministers and civil servants will look on the work happily if that got out? You think you'll get your appropriations from HMG if they knew that people had gone mad, died as an indirect result of work originated in this department?
You know this for a fact.
I know enough.
How?
privileged information. Sorry.
Dare you? Tell me.
I won't. And if you try to stop me or do anything at all to prejudice me, I'll blow the whistle on this whole bloody mess. Understand?
Following a confrontation with Drexel and his mystical mute acolyte called Morag, Crane is driving Julia, who has pursued him to Edinburgh to see her old friend Anne Reynolds. There, one evening, he sees a vision of Morag and crashes his car, thus killing his wife Julia outright. Stricken with heartbreak, Crane seeks retribution and reluctantly accepts an offer to work for Department 7 from its head, Mr. Andrew Scott Erskine. Anne Reynolds also works for the department, and in the following months, both she and Crane investigate various cases of the supernatural. She and Tom strike up a friendship, but this soon blossoms into something more. However, Roy Martindale, externally frigid and calculating, becomes belligerent of Tom and Anne's relationship, but Tom questions him for another reason, as he saw Martindale with his wife Julia before she was due to arrive in Edinburgh on the day she died. Although not denying the meeting, Martindale always seems to be hiding something. Tom eventually meets up with Drexel for the final confrontation. As further events unfold, Tom expands the theory that there is a covert organization which uses the Greek letter omega as its motif, planning to usurp the country using people with profoundly developed psychic abilities. We become more and more conscious that each instance of psychic activity is either initiated or manipulated by the Omega organization. Crane faces only skepticism from his superiors, but despite his self-doubts, is determined to crack their plot. However, in this shadowy domain, all is not what it seems, as realities blur with not only the otherworldly, but one which is saturated in narcotic-induced aberrations. Despite this central theme being consistent throughout, each episode of the Omega Factor is markedly different. Episode 1 is titled The Undiscovered Country, a sardonic quote from Hamlet referring to death itself.
The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have, than fly to others that we know not of.
This in fact nods towards Tom Crane's psychic skills as he confronts Drexel and asks to be shown a testimony of his power, but ends up finding the body of a dead devotee of Drexel through a psychic vision of his own. In the second episode, called Visitations, the spook factor is cranked up by several notches when a safe house used by Special Branch turns out to have a macabre history through its former use by Drexel himself, whom we now begin to recognise as a rather Aleister Crowley-esque messiah. Tom ends up possessed by a spirit which also provokes a man there to murder his comrade. Tom's brother Michael, first unveiled in part 1, returns to console with Tom after his wife Julia's death, moving nicely into the third instalment entitled Night Games, which sees Tom's brother snared in a military operation where a sonic device used for crowd control has been doctored by Drexel for his own ends and tuned to a point where visitations break through and ultimately result in Michael's mental breakdown when his mind is shattered. In story 4, called After Image, we get a vehicle for the character of Anne Reynolds, and this also gives Louise Jameson the opportunity to showcase her sterling thespian ability as her character is hijacked by American intelligence to access Department 7, But the Americans are also being manipulated by Drexel, who for his own ends uses sensory deprivation techniques to brainwash subjects, which in one case has created a psychopath. A group of students experiment with seances in the most notorious story of the series, called Powers of Darkness, which follows, despite the fact one has a nervous breakdown because of it and later dies of spontaneous human combustion. Another is taken over by the entity of a 16th century witch, and Tom has to force himself to be chemically induced into a coma to retrieve the girl's soul from possession. In a dreamlike sequence, we are shown Martindale is the force behind the possession, though Tom and Anne are unaware of it. Or does this show to us that the devil, or the personification of evil, has many faces? Poltergeists are the focus on episode 6, entitled Child's Play, where a young boy is plagued by an unruly spirit. This turns out to be only one of several facets of the child's psychic abilities, and we discover Tom had a comparable ordeal when he was a boy. Martindale eventually gets to oversee experiments on the child, which results in the murder of innocent people, but further experiments are precluded by a floundered attempt of the Omega organization to capture the child. Hearing the death of two old friends on a remote Scottish isle, Tom uses his psychic abilities to relive the events in the 7th episode, St. Anthony's Fire, and with the help of the local physician, Tom discovers other unexplicable and violent events as well. They both find that the Omega organization is using a pharmaceutical corporation as cover so they can conduct experiments using a serial disease known as ergot, which has similar effects as LSD, using it as a way to control people. Tom's brother returns to the series in Story 8, titled Out of Body, Out of Mind, after his breakdown in Episode 3, and is plagued by out-of-body experiences. And these, along with Martindale's experiments in the same field, provides Tom with a clue that the Omega organization is using similar techniques to murder an African leader. In the penultimate story, called Double Vision, Tom seems obsessed by the notion he has seen Julia, whilst a Russian called Vashirsky is conducting investigations into the exhumation of recently buried corpses. Both these elements are intertwined, and Tom finally stumbles upon the truth about his wife. Events in the final episode, titled Illusions, come to a head when a defecting scientist is kidnapped by Omega. Allegiances change, Tom's visions become more acute as he readily discovers the truth behind what this series has been progressing towards to this point, and what a journey it's been. Now, I won't give too much away, but I will say that the last episode is left wide open for a second series, which criminally didn't happen. Is it because it ruffled a few feathers of moral guardians, or because the Omega Factor was tucked away in the dead summer schedules rather than showcased for the autumn, or were the words of pithy journos like Nancy Banks Smith taken as the consensus of the public? This is debatable, and no defined explanation has been given. The Omega Factor is a well thought out series, with powerful central characters, plots with enough intrigue to shake a stick at, and has genuinely scary moments. It's curious also that the show was due to go out in an early time slot, pre-Watershed, which is inconceivable now, especially as the lily-livered woke generation has a grip on what we can see, and scarily also trying to influence what we should think. The episode Visitations is especially effective and reminiscent of Nigel Neal's The Stone Tape, with the haunted house setting, tape recordings that inexplicably contain screaming and tormented voices. And there's also a simple horror shot of Tom Crane, our hero of the piece, turning to face Anne. His face is lit from beneath, and his contorted expression is that of a man possessed. We must also mention the episode Powers of Darkness. Now, this is the episode that caused Mary Whitehouse to vent her disgust at the show, with its references to witchcraft, possession, dead bird symbology, spontaneous combustions and manifestations in a holy place of worship. Apparently, producer Galasio was immensely pleased by this, as this helped the show's publicity considerably, a bit like the British Board of Film Censors in the UK when they ban a movie. This turns something obscure into a must-see, a forbidden fruit. It was during this episode also that odd things happened on set, with Galasio and Louise Jameson confirming that clocks began to malfunction, cameras stopped working, and just before one scene where the séance was due to take place, the lights went out, plunging the set into darkness. The actress who played Morag recollects that the dress she wore in the first episodes went missing and was never seen again. Coincidences or something more divine, warning the production not to meddle in such things. Who knows? But it was enough to give some of the actors, who can be quite superstitious at the best of times, the jitters nevertheless. Because of its low-key effects, a bit like Sapphire and Steel, there is a general feeling of unease, of dabbling in things best left alone, one which is shared by the characters themselves. And 14 years before Mulder met Scully, we have Anne Reynolds, the rational scientist, juxtaposed against Tom Crane's wilder theories and beliefs that there is something more than just heaven and earth. There's also some wonderful nuances I noted of characterizations, and these are skillfully woven into the story but without being too dominant. For example, the main lead's taste in music. Now, the character of Anne Reynolds is seen enjoying popular and traditional musicality, whilst Roy is a modernist, preferring advances made in the 20th century, serious compositions. Tom is the emotional post-hippie, a sensitive soul enjoying the likes of Pink Floyd, reflecting his supposed greater humanity. Anne's tastes show her seriousness is mingled with a sense of tradition, even sentimentality, whilst Roy's are clinical and pared to the bone. Tom and Anne's compatibility is shown by their shared love of film and cinema, whilst Roy is a theatre man. We also see the characterisation and dress sense. Tom is scruffy, slightly unconventional and maverick. Anne is very smart, but not unexpressive in her taste, whilst Roy Martindale is decked out in official-looking suits. And what, dear viewer, of the reality behind the stories? So well researched, thanks no doubt to Galasio, Gerson and Dr. Ray. Now, concerning ESP, it was in 1870 that ESP, or extrasensory perception, was alleged to have been coined by Sir Richard Burton. No, not the wonderful alcohol-sodden actor, but Burton the British explorer. 12 years later, and in 1882, it saw telepathy and mind reading formally introduced after research was undertaken by the Society of Psychical Research in Britain and further championed by research in 1884 by our cousins stateside. It was Paul Jouard in 1892, a French researcher of the paranormal, that used ESP to describe an ability of a person under hypnosis and placed in a trance-like state who could then sense things without using a human being's ordinary five senses. In the 1930s, at Duke University, it was there that J.B. Rhine popularised the term of ESP to denounce psychic ability utilising the skills of telepathy and clairvoyance. As part of experiments, Rhine and his spouse, Louisa, developed research by introducing the Zener cards, now called ESP cards. Now, these were the cards that had a circle, square, wavy lines, a cross and a star, and composed of 5 cards in a set of 25. Booths were set up, partitioning 2 people. One is the sender and one is a receiver. The sender would focus on a particular symbol and the receiver would sense the image using their mind based on the sender's transmission. A high score would, according to Rhine, would be 1 chance in 1,000. However, they were criticised for the statistics' unreliability, with only favourable results making it to publication. In our times, computers now determine these results. In 1940, Rhine, J.G. Pratt, and other learned parapsychologists at Duke University took to reviewing the data from the Zener card experiments and concluded that after 60 years, 60% of results indicated ESP ability.
How did I do?
In a block of 25 cards, in which there are only 5 different symbols, the expected number of correct guesses is 5. You have guessed an average of 9.75. The odds against your score being due to chance are 7 millions to 1.
Move forward, and it was in the 1950s that a scandal hit the headlines, and this scandal can also be reflected a few times in the Omega Factor. And it concerns MKUltra, MKULTRA. Now, MKUltra was a top-secret CIA program in the experimentation of mind control, ideal for a Cold War scenario. MKUltra used unknowing people in experimentation with vast quantities of LSD to break minds where it was thought LSD in vast quantities would leave a victim void into which new impulses or a brand new personality could be implanted. The experiment resulted in the death of Frank Olson, a bacteriologist and biological warfare scientist who was employed by the United States Army Biological Warfare Division. Olson was covertly administered a dose of LSD so big that in 1953 he went off his head and jumped to his death from a hotel window. This opened up a mammoth can of worms, revealing an underbelly of the CIA littered with cover-ups, falsification, deceit, and possibly one of the CIA's darkest truths about the use of pharmaceutical mind control. Also in 1953, dogs were being trained to detect landmines through ESP. These beautiful creatures were trained over a period of 3 months, and 2 dogs in California found 6 out of 7 mines without sensory cues. Then when we go into the 1960s, and 1964 to be exact, the progress into ESP also established that through hypnosis, extrasensory perception could be amplified, and the success rate of psychic ability was boosted to 64%. And by the end of this decade, a large majority of people were psychic, as they were off their tits on all sorts of pills, potions, and inhalations. Only joking, but it did create some fantastic visual art though, didn't it? In 1971, Apollo astronaut Edgar Dean Mitchell dabbled with ESP, where secret extrasensory perception experiments were carried out during the space mission. Following a period of sleep, Mitchell would focus on a series of symbols and shapes on a clipboard, and where 4 men back on Earth tried to receive these psychic pictures from telepathic signals across the void. And leading up to the series broadcast, in 1974 there were the Ganzfeld test, and these findings were published. This also features in the Omega Factor. The findings were made by Charles Oniton and Sharon Harper in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research. The Ganzfeld test comprised a 30-minute session where 2 persons, one in the role of sender and the other in the role of receiver, both lay on chairs reclining, their eyes covered in halved ping-pong balls in order that their visual field was that of a solid white. White noise was played in the background, and the subjects were asked to freely associate images out loud whilst their responses were recorded onto magnetic tape. In another room, the telepathic sender chose a random set of slides to absorb, and they would then try to transmit or send these images through their mind into the mind of the receiver. When the experiment finished, the subject was then asked which of the reels from a group of 4 had been the target. Even today, further research continues into the power of the mind, although it is a very low-key affair, saturated and glossed over by the marvels of artificial intelligence, which is all well and good, but I ask you, dear viewer, what about the capabilities and power of our own? Do we need to look beyond the fingertips of our outstretched hands, or maybe perhaps inwardly, deeper? And if hypnotism is guff, then why is hypnotizing a television audience or using the television as a form of hypnotizing viewers still illegal in UK broadcasting? Well, dear viewer, it seems we need not to watch the stars, but we need to keep watching humankind here on terra firma, and seemingly there still is much, much more to understand what is revealed from inner space rather than outer. Be very careful what you wish for, as if your will is strong enough as Tom Crane's, Drexel's, or the Omega organization, it might just become a reality. Check out the Omega Factor. It's simply brilliant. Until next time on Look, Look and Look Again, cheerio.